For our first exercise, we're going to be exploring space and pace, the space of the frame and movement within it. Let's take a look. I'm going to go quickly over how to save your project into a folder. You should already have seen this, but I want to review it because it's super important because you're going to be submitting a link to your project folder. So in File, if you went to Save As, you could see that I've got a folder set up. You can name it anything you like as long as you can find it. And I've got my project AEP extension saved in there. Super important. If I click on this icon right at the bottom of my project window, that's an easy way to get into a new composition. So I'm going to name this Space and Pace. I'm going to, this is fine, so width is 1920 by 1080 square pixels. I'm going to make it 30 frames a second. And I'm going to change the time down here to 15 seconds. Make sure it's the second set of numbers after the colon here. Those numbers, the ones on the very right, are frames. So you don't want to make it 15 frames. It's a very short animation. It's half a second, right? You want to make it 15 seconds. Now, if you're ever needing to change the settings, say you did make it 15 frames, you want to change that, or you want to change the aspect ratio, you can go up to Composition Settings, or press Command-K. It brings you back to that window. So just as a reminder, that's a super important thing to remember if you ever want to change any of these numbers at any point. Now, I've got my screen set up by default to have this checkerboard pattern where there is nothing. If I export this as just this empty space, it's going to be by default video black, right? Unless I put something there. But I can click on and off that by toggling the transparency grid down here, so I can show you what we'll have, right? But by default, I like to have it here. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to take it off so you can see just a black background. The first thing I'm going to do is draw an ellipse or a circle with my Shape Builder tool up here in the toolbar. So I'm going to click and hold and select the ellipse tool. And when I'm drawing this circle, I want it to be a perfect circle, so equal in diameter all the way around. To do that, I hold down Shift, click and drag out, and I get a perfect circle. Now I've got my stroke enabled here, so I'm going to take the stroke off by clicking on the text of the stroke and just clicking that off. So now I just have the white fill. And I can change colors here by clicking on the fill color, and I can make it, say, a red circle. Why not? So now I've got my perfect circle. It lives in a shape layer, and if I ever want to rename my layers, I click on it and press return. I can just easily shortcut this by calling this circle. Good idea to get naming your layers, get into the habit of naming your layers. This will help in the long run as you have more and more layers, keep yourself organized. For the time being, I'm going to just ignore the Ellipse 1 menu and only use the Layer Transform menu, which affects everything on that layer. So the super important one to keep in mind here is position, right? And here we have our X and our Y coordinates. And if I ever want to reset what I've done, I can just click on this reset button and it goes back to the center. So all of these properties, right, we're going to be looking at eventually, but for today we're going to focus on really on position and on scale. So first of all, let's move this in the X and Y dimension, right? So to create movement, I have to have a keyframe, right? I have to make keyframes. To do that, I'm going to click on the little stopwatch next to the position, right? And that sets a keyframe wherever this blue playhead is. I'm going to move it forward to a second, and I can see my second marked. There's a couple of ways to see that information. One is underneath that composition window here. Also here on the timeline window, you can see them at 1 second. So I'll make another keyframe, not by hitting the stopwatch again, but by hitting the little diamond key. So that creates 2 keyframes, right? So right now nothing's moving because nothing is changing between those 2 points, right? If we remember from looking at the introductory videos. So I'm going to make some changes there between the two. So just a reminder, if I press the stopwatch again, right, it's going to stop the race, right? The stopwatch only starts and ends the race. So I'll press Command Z to undo that. So only subsequent keyframes, I would only press the diamond, right? So between these two, let's move it from out of screen, into screen, and stop, okay? So the first keyframe, I'm going to take that position, and I can use my arrow tool to do this, or I can use the numbers. I like the numbers because they're much more exact, right? I can actually change these 2 dimensions on their own. So to do that, I'm just going to move this off screen on the X axis. So now, if I press my spacebar to preview this, this takes a second to come onto that first position. Now, I'm going to make this a little bit more of a dramatic movement. So a good way to jump between keyframes here is to actually use the little arrow keys next to the diamond. I can just jump between 2. I'm going to make this actually stop at the edge of, I'm just clicking and holding and dragging that number, right? And you can do this numerically. You can type in a number, right, if you want. So now, if I preview this area, drag this back, I'm actually going to take my playhead here and just work area and just preview area only what I need, right? I'll just actually take it to 2 seconds. So just by clicking and holding that one, it'll only preview this section. So I'll press spacebar again. All right, so it's previewing now my motion. That's fine. That's my x-axis movement. Now, from this second point, I'm going to move it here. I'm actually going to do it exactly by clicking on my arrow key. I'm going to make another keyframe for my Y position. Now, here's where I would like you to get used to separating these elements a little bit. So if I control-click on position, I can actually separate those dimensions. So now I get an X and a Y position that are separate, which is really cool. And you can see it created 2 keyframes on each line because when it's together like that, it actually takes both of that information into account. So I'm going to take the Y keyframes and erase them by clicking on the stopwatch. So now this thing only moves on the X dimension, but now I want to make it a keyframe here on the Y position. So to drop it down right at 2, so I can just do this. I can also type this in. So do like 115. I'm going to drop this down. So now I'm going to use my numbers just to drop it down. And you can see it created a very rigid, so the 2 motions are separate, right? That's very important in this exercise, to separate these dimensions and separate the action. Moves across, moves down. Moves across, moves down. Something you want to do here is actually to condense this action a little bit, right? So I'm going to take this keyframe, move it in closer. That'll actually create a quicker action for this, right? So say I want it only to take half a second, which is 15 frames in a 30 frames a second composition. So now, let's see what that looks like. Now it moves a little faster. Now I've got X and Y movement. Now let's try Z movement, which is movement in depth, right? I'll make another one of these by going up to Layer, New, Shape Layer. And I'm going to draw another circle. Shift, hold down, and draw my circle. Maybe I'll make it a different color this time. Maybe I'll go make it a blue circle. And with this circle, I'm going to use my Align menu to make sure it's right in the center, okay? So to do that, Window, make sure Align is selected here. And I'm going to use these two, the Align horizontally and Align vertically. And because I'm doing a depth exercise, I have to make sure that this anchor point, see that little node there, is in the center of the object. Let me show you, as currently placed, what that anchor point does and when I scale it. So I'm going to transform again, and I'll just scale this out. You can see that it's scaling up and down from the anchor point, right? We want this to actually be a center anchor point, right? Press undo. I'm going to control click on the layer, or right click on the layer. I'm going to go to a transform menu and then select this center anchor point in layer content. Now it's automatically right in the center. It's also in the center of the frame because I used the align menu. So those two things are super important for controlling your shapes. So remember those. Now, let's just rename my layer here. So I'll press return with it selected and call it depth circle. Now I can trim these layers, right? Because I don't need all of the whole layer. Go to the end here, hover over the end of the clip, and when I get those little arrows, I can just drag it back to this point. I can hold down Shift, so I snap to this point. But if you take a look at it, if I press U on my keyboard, I can see just the keyframes for that one. Still have my keyframes there. And now I've got my depth circle, right? So the depth circle, I'm just going to drop it into depth, right? So I can go into these elements. So in my transform menu on the layer, I'm going to click on a keyframe for position and scale. And maybe we start this out of the frame. So let's move it over a little bit and down as a starting keyframe. So maybe in this corner. And then I'll move it forward. I'll use my numbers this time. I'll just type in 15, so half a second. Now what I'm going to do for my next keyframe is to actually put it in the center with my align. So now it does this, right? It comes in, and if I want to put a pause in, here's how I can, one way I can put a pause in is just by repeating this keyframe. So now, because there's no change between the two, it pauses. Now we'll drop it into space. So let's take that scale keyframe and move it right to that point. And you can always zoom in to make sure you're right at that point. We are. Okay. And let's take another half second, so 15. And we can do this numerically. So it goes to 0. So now let's preview our action. X and Y position, Z position. And we just put a little manual stop in there by repeating the keyframe. So that's the first part of our exercise. Just getting keyframes established for movement in the frame, right? We've got movement in and out of the frame. We've got movement in depth. So the next thing we want to do is just put a little title card there. So have that last for a second. So let's go up to my text button here. And if I just click on the frame, I'm going to get an empty text layer, right? And it'll automatically bring up this menu, which is my character menu, which you should be familiar with from other Adobe programs. But here you can select your typeface family and your size, which are probably the two most important things for this, right? So it's quite large, so I'm going to make it, say, 200, which is fine. And in this drop-down menu, you have your selection here. I'm going to stick with what I've got here. Oh, make sure that it's open. And I'm going to start typing. So call this space. And again, I'm going to align it center. And I'll maybe change it from gray to like a little more luminosity with the white. And that's fine. Now I don't want this thing to last the whole way through, right? So we're going to put this at the beginning, right? So let's select these, and I can select multiple lines, multiple layers by shift selecting and just moving it over. So I'm going to move it to the 1 second mark, and I'm going to just, with those selected, move it to a second. Trim it just to that point. I'm going to hit Option and bracket. So now I get this. I get a title card, I get my X and Y motions, and my depth.